What's something small you notice that shows someone has been through a lot? Story 1. There's this new guy at work, and his desk is always spotless. Not just tidy, like military inspection ready, spotless. One day I joked, "What's with the precision? Were you in the army?" He gave me a look, half amused, half guarded, and said, "No, it's just easier to notice when something's missing." Turns out he used to be homeless. Keeping things in perfect order was his way of making sure nothing got stolen. Story 2. I was at a cafe when I noticed this woman brushing crumbs into her hand, quietly, like she was trying not to draw attention. I asked if she needed anything, and she laughed nervously, saying, "Old habit. Back in the shelter, if you didn't clean up after yourself, you wouldn't get your next meal." Her voice was steady, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Story 3. At a party, this guy kept apologizing every time he grabbed a slice of pizza. By the fifth time, I had to ask why he was so worried about it. He laughed awkwardly and said, "Growing up with 3 older brothers, you only ate what they left behind. Old habits die hard." It wasn't a joke. He meant it. Story 4. My friend never leaves the house without a water bottle. Even if she's just going to the corner store, it's always with her. One day, I teased her, asking if she thought the apocalypse was coming. She just shrugged and said, "When I was a kid, our water got shut off for 3 days. We couldn't afford bottled water. Now I always make sure I have some." She said it so casually, but it hit hard. Story 5. There's a guy at work who never forgets anyone's birthday. He's the first to say happy birthday, brings handmade cards, even bakes cupcakes. Someone joked he was just doing it for attention. He smiled and said, "When I was a kid, people forgot my birthday 3 years in a row. I just don't want anyone else to feel that way." The room went silent after that. Too long. Didn't read. People who've been through a lot leave subtle clues if you pay attention. Story 6. There's a guy at my gym who's always meticulous about wiping down every machine, before and after using it. I mean, he scrubs the handles, the seats, even the tiniest corners, like he's prepping it for surgery. One day, someone laughed and asked, "Man, are you afraid of catching something, or what?" He smiled awkwardly and said, "No, just a habit. Grew up in a group home where no one cleaned up after themselves. If you didn't wipe things down, you'd end up sick more often than not." The way he said it was casual, but there was something in his tone, like he wasn't talking about just germs. It made me realize that what seemed like overkill was just his way of protecting himself, something he probably had to learn the hard way. Story 7. At a dinner party, this girl couldn't sit still. Every 5 minutes she'd jump up, clearing plates, refilling glasses, asking if anyone needed anything. Someone finally laughed and said, "Hey, take a break. You're a guest, not the caterer." She froze for a second, then laughed it off, saying, "Sorry, I guess I'm used to it." Later, when we were cleaning up, I asked her what she meant. She shrugged and said, "When I was younger, my mom made it pretty clear I had to earn my keep. If I didn't pull my weight at home, I'd hear about it for weeks. So now I don't feel right unless I'm doing something." It wasn't dramatic, but the way she said it, like it was no big deal, made it clear it was. 48. There's this older guy at work who always brings extra food for the office fridge. Sandwiches, snacks, even whole meals sometimes. One day, someone joked, "You trying to fatten us up or what?" He chuckled and said, "Nah, just don't like seeing an empty fridge. Reminds me of when I didn't have anything to put in one." That got everyone's attention. He didn't elaborate, but later I found out from someone else that he'd grown up in extreme poverty. Bringing food wasn't about generosity. It was his way of making sure no one else had to feel that kind of emptiness. Story 9. In my apartment complex, there's a woman who always makes small talk with the maintenance staff. She knows their names, their kids' names, and even brings them coffee sometimes. One day, I asked her why she went out of her way to do it. She said, "When I first moved here, I worked as a janitor. People treated me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was part of the furniture. It costs nothing to acknowledge someone, but it can mean everything." That stuck with me. She wasn't just being nice. She was making sure no one else felt the way she once did. Story 10. I used to work with a guy who always kept a spare phone charger at his desk and offered it to anyone who needed it. One day I joked, "What, are you the office tech support now?" He laughed and said, "Nah, I just know what it's like to not have the tools you need when you're barely getting by." Later, I found out he used to sleep in his car after losing his apartment. That charger wasn't just a convenience, it was his reminder of what it felt like to need a little help and not have anyone there to give it. Too long. Didn't read. People carry their stories in the smallest habits, and if you look closely, you'll see what they've been through. Story 11. There's a guy in my building who always checks on his neighbors when there's a power outage. Last time, he knocked on every single door, asking if anyone needed anything. I joked, "What, are you running for mayor?" He smiled and said, "Nah, I just remember how it feels to sit in the dark and wonder if anyone cares." Later, I learned he grew up in foster care and spent many nights alone when no one came to check on him. His way of caring now was what he wished someone had done for him back then. Story 12. A co-worker of mine always carries a small first aid kit in her bag. Bandages, ointments, even painkillers. One day, during a meeting, someone cut their finger and she whipped out the kit like she was a medic on a battlefield. When I asked why she carried all that, she said, "My mom was a nurse and we couldn't afford trips to the hospital. If we got hurt, we patched ourselves up at home." Her face softened as she added, "I guess I just like being prepared, because you never know when someone might need it." Story 13. At the local coffee shop, there's this barista who always greets every customer like they're an old friend. It's not forced. He genuinely remembers names, orders, and even little details people share. I asked him once how he keeps track of so many people, and he said, "When I was younger, no one ever remembered my name. Not teachers, not neighbors, not even some family members. I just want people to feel seen." It hit me that his kindness wasn't just a personality trait. It was his way of making up for the connection he didn't have growing up. Story 14. I have a friend who always keeps cash on her for tips, even for small things, like someone holding the door or helping carry groceries. One time I asked her why she's so generous, and she said, "When I was in college, I worked 3 jobs just to stay afloat. A $5 tip once meant I could eat that day. Now, if I can be that for someone else, I will." It wasn't about the money for her. It was about giving people the same lifeline she once desperately needed. Story 15. There's a guy in my running group who always finishes dead last in races. It's not that he's slow. He deliberately hangs back to check on other runners, making sure no one's struggling or hurt. I asked him why he does it, and he said, "When I was in high school cross country, I collapsed during a race. No one stopped to help, not even my coach. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone else struggling, I'd never just run past." He shrugged like it was no big deal, but you could tell it meant everything to him. Too long. Didn't read. Little habits often hide the biggest stories, and the people who've been through the most are often the ones who quietly make the world a little better. Story 16. There's this older woman in my neighborhood who always feeds the stray cats. She carries bags of food and water bottles wherever she goes, making sure every alley cat is taken care of. One day, I asked her why she bothered so much, and she said, "When I was little, my family couldn't afford to feed me every day. I promised myself that if I could help anyone, anything, I'd never let them go hungry." She said it so matter-of-factly, but it made me look at her in a completely different light. Story 17. At work, there's a guy who always volunteers to stay late when something goes wrong, even if it's not his fault. One night, I asked why he was always the last one out. He said, "Growing up, my dad worked 3 jobs and never had anyone to help him. I figure if I can make someone's day a little easier, I should." It wasn't a grand speech, just a quiet explanation that spoke volumes about the kind of person he is. Story 18. I know someone who always leaves a little extra food on their plate when they eat out, no matter what. One time I joked about it, asking if they were watching their diet or something. They said, "When I was a kid, we'd always save part of our meals for later, because we never knew when the next one would come." It wasn't until they said it that I realized how much those habits from the past can stick with you. Story 19. There's a woman at my office who always keeps a drawer stocked with snacks, and she's quick to offer them to anyone who looks even slightly hungry. I asked her once why she does it, and she said, "I remember being too embarrassed to tell anyone I didn't have lunch money in school. I'd sit through lunch pretending I wasn't hungry. If I can stop someone else from feeling that way, I will." She said it with a smile, but her voice cracked just a little, and it stayed with me all day. Story 20. I have a neighbor who always makes sure our entire block is shoveled and salted after it snows. No one asks him to do it, he just does. One time I asked why he bothered, and he said, "When I was a kid, my dad slipped on ice and broke his leg. We didn't have money for a hospital, and it messed him up for life. If I can stop that from happening to someone else, why wouldn't I?" His reasoning was simple, but the weight of it made me see him differently. Too long. Didn't read. The smallest actions often carry the heaviest histories. You'd be surprised how much someone's past shapes what they do in the present. Story 21. There's a man in my office who always says thank you to the cleaning staff, every single time. It doesn't matter if it's just someone emptying the trash or wiping down a desk. He stops whatever he's doing to acknowledge them. One day, I asked him about it, curious why he went out of his way when most people barely noticed the cleaning crew. He said, "Tata, when I was younger, my mom worked as a janitor. She'd come home exhausted every night and tell me how most people treated her like she wasn't even there. I decided then that I'd never make anyone feel invisible." His voice was steady, but there was this quiet pride behind it, like he was honoring her memory with every thank you. Story 22. There's a guy at my local grocery store who always double-checks the prices on everything he buys, even if it's just a pack of gum. I jokingly asked him once if he didn't trust the scanners, and he laughed before saying, "Old habit. When I was a kid, my mom used to send me to the store with exact change, and if I miscalculated even by a penny, it meant we couldn't get what we needed. It stuck with me." He didn't say it like he was fishing for sympathy. It was just a fact. But the next time I saw him, I couldn't help but notice how carefully he picked out each item, like he still carried the weight of those moments. Story 23. A friend of mine always offers to drive people home after parties, even if it's out of his way. One night, I asked him why he was always so insistent about it, and his face grew serious. "When I was a kid, my cousin died in a car accident because his friend decided to drive drunk. It wrecked my whole family. If I can stop even one person from going through that, it's worth it." He didn't say more, but the way he gripped the steering wheel told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't just a ride. It was his way of making sure no one else had to feel that kind of pain. Story 24. There's a woman in my apartment building who waters all the plants in the lobby, even though no one asked her to. I asked her about it once, and she smiled, saying, "When I was little, we couldn't afford anything green. No flowers, no plants, nothing. I promised myself that when I had my own space, I'd make sure it was full of life." She laughed a little, adding, "This isn't exactly my space, but it feels good to see something grow." After that, I started noticing how the plants always looked healthier and more vibrant than they had before. Her small act of care transformed the space, and honestly, it made the building feel more like home. Story 25. There's a teacher at my old high school who never lets a student sit alone at lunch. He'll either sit with them or quietly encourage another group to invite them over. I ran into him years later and asked why he cared so much about something most teachers didn't even notice. He sighed and said, "When I was a kid, I ate lunch alone every day for 2 years. No one talked to me, no one noticed. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone else in that position, I'd make sure they didn't feel invisible." He said it like it was no big deal, but you could see the emotion in his eyes, like those memories still lingered. It wasn't just about lunch, it was about making sure no one else felt that kind of loneliness. Too long. Didn't read. People's smallest gestures often have the deepest roots, shaped by the quiet struggles they've carried for years. You just have to notice. Story 26. There's a guy in my neighborhood who always puts out extra chairs during our block parties. No one asks him to, but every time there's an event, there's a row of neatly arranged folding chairs, just in case someone needs a seat. One day, I asked him why he bothered, and he smiled softly. Growing up, we didn't have enough chairs at the table for everyone. I'd always end up eating on the floor, trying not to spill. It's not a big deal now, but back then, it felt like I didn't belong. He shrugged like it was nothing, but there was a quiet pain in his voice. Now, every time I see those chairs, I think about how something so small to one person can mean everything to another. Story 27. I know a woman who always leaves a few quarters in the coin slot of laundromat machines after she's done. One day, I asked her why, and she said, "When I was in college, I couldn't afford to do my laundry some weeks. I'd wait around hoping to find a forgotten quarter or two in the machines, and sometimes it was the only way I could make it work." Her voice was calm, but you could tell the memory wasn't far away. Now, leaving those quarters behind isn't just an act of kindness. It's her way of paying forward the small, unseen help she once desperately needed. Story 28. There's this guy I know who keeps a box of school supplies in his car. Pencils, notebooks, crayons, the works. Whenever he sees kids selling candy bars or holding bake sales, he stops and offers them what they need. I asked him once why he carried all that around, and he told me, "When I was a kid, my parents couldn't afford school supplies. I remember sitting in class trying to borrow pencils or make do without, feeling embarrassed. I don't want any kid to feel like that if I can help it." It wasn't a grand gesture to him, just something he did without thinking, but it stuck with me. Story 29. There's a man in our community who always shows up at fundraisers and charity events, even if it's just to volunteer. I once asked him why he got involved in so many causes, and he said, "When I was younger, my family relied on food drives and donations, just to make it through the holidays. I remember the faces of the people who helped us, even if I don't know their names. This is my way of saying thank you." He didn't make a big deal out of it, but you could see the gratitude in his eyes, like those small acts of kindness he received still lived with him every day. 30. I have a coworker who's always the first to notice when someone's struggling. If someone's quiet in a meeting or looks tired, she'll quietly check in after. One day, I asked her how she always seemed to pick up on what others missed, and she said, "When I was in my 20s, I was going through a really bad time. I'd come to work, smile, and pretend everything was fine, but no one ever asked if I was okay. I don't blame them. They didn't know. But I promised myself that if I ever noticed someone else hurting, I wouldn't ignore it." She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, but her words stuck with me. She wasn't just kind. She was someone who'd learned the hard way how much a simple question could mean. Too long. Didn't read. Behind the quiet kindness of some people lies a history of struggle, where every small act carries a much larger story. You just have to ask. Story 31. There's a guy in my building who always checks the elevator buttons before getting in, wiping them with a tissue if they're dirty. At first, I thought it was a quirky habit, but one day, I asked him about it. He hesitated, then said, "When I was a kid, I lived in a housing project where the elevators were always filthy, sometimes broken. We'd take the stairs to avoid touching anything. Cleaning this now, it's just something I do so no one else feels like they have to avoid it." He laughed it off, but the way he stood there, looking at the buttons like they held a memory, told me this was more than just a habit. Story 32. There's an older woman at my gym who brings extra towels and hands them out to anyone who forgets theirs. She doesn't work there, she just keeps a stash in her bag. One day, I asked her why she did it, and she smiled, saying, "When I was younger, I couldn't afford a gym, so I'd sneak into classes and hope no one noticed I didn't have the right gear. People were kind. They shared towels, lent me mats. I never forgot that. Her voice was steady, but there was a warmth in her eyes, like she was still repaying a debt she never really owed. Story 33. A coworker of mine always insists on walking people to their cars after late-night shifts. It doesn't matter how tired he is. He'll wait around to make sure no one's left alone in the parking lot. One night, I asked him why he cared so much, and he said, "My sister was attacked walking home from work when I was a teenager. I wasn't there to help her, and I'll never forgive myself for it. If I can stop someone else from going through that, I will." He said it so quietly I almost didn't catch it, but the weight of his words stayed with me. It wasn't just about safety. It was about redemption. Story 34. There's a man in my church who always brings homemade casseroles to the food pantry. He's not wealthy. He works 2 jobs just to get by, but he always finds the time and money to cook for others. I asked him once why he didn't just donate canned goods like most people, and he said, "When I was little, the only hot meals we got were from kind neighbors who'd bring over food. It felt like love, you know. I want people to feel that, not just get a can of soup." His voice cracked a little, but he quickly covered it with a smile. It wasn't just about feeding people. It was about giving them a piece of dignity. 35. There's a guy at the dog park who always carries extra leashes and water bowls. He hands them out to anyone who needs them, no questions asked. One day, I asked him why, and he said, "I used to have a dog when I was homeless. He was my only friend, but I couldn't always take care of him the way I wanted to. A stranger once gave me a leash when mine broke, and it meant the world to me. Now I just try to do the same." He said it like it was no big deal, but the way his voice softened when he talked about his old dog made it clear it still mattered. Too long. Didn't read. Kindness is often rooted in the pain of what people have lived through. The little things they do now are their way of making sure no one else has to feel the way they once did. Story 36. There's a woman in my neighborhood who always leaves a handwritten note on her garbage can for the sanitation workers. Every week, without fail, she thanks them for their work and wishes them a good day. I finally asked her why she went out of her way when most people barely notice those guys. She smiled and said, "My dad was a sanitation worker. He worked 12-hour shifts, rain or shine, and came home too tired to even talk sometimes. People treated him like he didn't exist. I just want to remind them that someone sees and appreciates what they do." Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened around her coffee cup. That small act of gratitude wasn't just about being polite. It was her way of honoring her dad and the life he gave her. Story 37. A guy I know always buys an extra meal when he's out at a fast food place and leaves it on a table with a note that says, "For anyone who needs it." One day, I asked him why he did it, and he said, "When I was 19, I couldn't afford food most days. I'd walk into restaurants just to sit down and smell something warm. I never had the guts to take someone's leftovers, but I thought about it. Now, I figure if I can stop someone else from feeling that kind of shame, I should." His voice cracked a little, and he quickly looked away, like the memory was still too close. Story 38. There's a man at my office who always shows up early to meetings and sets out extra notepads and pens for everyone. He even brings water bottles and arranges them neatly at the table. One day, I teased him about being overly prepared, and he said, "When I was starting out, I couldn't afford good supplies for work. I'd borrow pens from coworkers and hope no one noticed. It made me feel small. I just want to make sure no one else feels that way." He said it casually, like it was nothing, but you could see the way his hands lingered on the pens, making sure everything was just right. Story 39. There's a guy in my running group who always sticks around after a race to cheer on the last runners crossing the finish line. He claps and yells encouragement like they're Olympic athletes. One time, I asked him why he cared so much, and he said, "When I ran my first race, I was dead last. People had already packed up and gone home by the time I finished. It was humiliating. Now, I just want to make sure no one else feels like they're doing it alone." His voice was calm, but the way his face softened told me he was still carrying that memory with him. Story 40. There's a teacher at my old high school who always makes sure the vending machines are stocked with healthy snacks, even though he has to pay for them out of his own pocket. When I asked him why, he said, "When I was in high school, I couldn't afford lunch most days. I'd walk past the vending machines, wishing I could even buy a granola bar. Now, I just want to make sure no kid has to go hungry while staring at food they can't have." He smiled as he said it, but his eyes looked far away, like he was back in those hallways, feeling that hunger all over again. Too long. Didn't read. Behind every small act of kindness is a story, often one of struggle, where someone decided they didn't want others to feel what they once did. Look closely, and you'll see the echoes of their past. Story 41. There's a guy at my favorite coffee shop who always picks up the check for the person behind him in line, every single time. It's not flashy. He just hands the cashier a 20, says, "For the next one," and leaves. I finally asked him why, and he smiled, almost sheepishly. When I was a kid, my mom used to treat us to hot chocolate on really bad days, like when the car broke down or she couldn't pay the bills. She'd say, "At least we can still have this." It made everything feel a little less heavy. I figure, maybe I can give someone else that moment. His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, like he was remembering those bad days and how much that one small comfort had meant. Story 42. A woman in my building keeps a box of blankets in the lobby every winter with a note. "Take one if you're cold." She replenishes it every week without fail. Curious, I asked her why she started doing it. She told me, "When I first moved here, I couldn't afford to keep the heat on. I spent most of that winter wrapped in whatever I could find. Old sweaters, towels, anything. I don't want anyone else to go through that." She laughed like it was no big deal, but her voice wavered just enough to let me know it still haunted her. Now, every time I see someone pick up a blanket, I think about how her kindness comes from a place of quiet survival. Story 43. There's a guy at work who always makes sure there's coffee in the break room, even if it means stopping at the store on his way in. One day, I jokingly asked if he was trying to win Employee of the Month. He just smiled and said, "When I started out, I worked in a warehouse with no coffee, no snacks, nothing. 12-hour shifts, and you were lucky if the vending machine wasn't broken. It sucked. I just don't want people to feel like they're not cared for." He shrugged like it was nothing. But later, I noticed how carefully he stocked the supplies, making sure there were different creamers, enough sugar, even decaf. It wasn't just coffee. It was his way of making sure no one felt as invisible as he once did. Story 44. I know a woman who brings fresh flowers to the local nursing home every week. She doesn't work there, doesn't have family there. She just shows up with a bouquet for the common room and smaller ones for anyone who wants them. I asked her why she does it, and she said, "My grandma spent her last years in a place like this. She loved flowers, but no one ever thought to bring her any. I promised myself that if I could, I'd make sure other people didn't feel forgotten." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled just a little as she adjusted the bouquet. It wasn't just a kind gesture. It was her way of keeping a promise to someone she loved. Story 45. There's a man in my community who always keeps a stack of bus passes in his pocket. Whenever he sees someone struggling to pay, he quietly hands one over and walks away. I finally worked up the nerve to ask him why, and he said, "When I was 20, I couldn't afford the bus to get to my first job interview. I had to walk 3 miles in the rain and showed up soaked. The guy who interviewed me lent me money for a ride home. I got the job, and I've never forgotten what that small act of kindness did for me." His voice was calm, but his eyes glistened, like he was right back in that moment, drenched and desperate. Now those bus passes are his way of paying forward the chance someone once gave him. Too long. Didn't read. People's kindness often comes from a place of deep struggle. Their small actions aren't just random. They're a reflection of what they've lived through and the change they want to make in the world. Story 46. There's a woman in my office who always keeps extra umbrellas in her car. Every time it rains, she walks around offering them to anyone who doesn't have one. refusing to take them back afterward. I finally asked her why, and she said, "When I first moved to this city, I didn't know anyone. One day, it started pouring while I was waiting for the bus. A stranger handed me an umbrella and said, 'Keep it, you'll need it.' I didn't even get his name. That umbrella got me through my first year here. Now, I just figure I can pass it on." She said it so casually, but her voice softened as she spoke, like she could still feel that moment of unexpected kindness. Her habit wasn't just practical. It was her way of repaying a debt to someone she never got the chance to thank. Story 47. There's a guy in my neighborhood who always repairs broken bikes for free. He sets up a small station outside his garage on weekends, fixing flat tires and tightening chains for kids and adults alike. One day, I stopped by to ask why he did it, and he said, "When I was 10, my bike broke, and we couldn't afford to fix it. I had to watch my friends ride off every day while I stayed behind. Then, one day, a neighbor fixed it for me. Wouldn't even take $1. I never forgot that." His voice was steady, but the way he looked at the bike in his hands told me he was still that 10-year-old boy, grateful for someone's kindness. Now, he spends his weekends making sure no kid has to feel left out, like he once did. Story 48. There's a man at my church who always stays after services to stack chairs and clean up, even when no one asks him to. Curious, I asked him why he was so consistent about it, and he smiled, saying, "When I was a kid, we didn't have much. My parents always said if we couldn't give money, we could give time. It's a habit that stuck with me." Then he paused and added, "But really, it's because I know what it's like to feel like you don't have anything to offer. Doing this reminds me that everyone can contribute, even in small ways." The way he said it, like it was second nature to him, made me realize his actions weren't just about helping. They were about holding on to a sense of purpose, something he'd learned the hard way. Story 49. There's a teacher at my kid's school who always makes sure every student has proper winter gear. Coats, hats, gloves, you name it. If a kid shows up without something, she has a stash in her classroom and quietly gives it to them. No questions asked. One day, I asked her how she managed to collect all that, and she said, "When I was a little girl, my mom couldn't afford a winter coat for me. I remember standing at the bus stop in the snow, pretending I wasn't cold because I didn't want the other kids to laugh. Then one day, my teacher handed me a coat and said, 'It's yours now.' I never forgot that feeling of being cared for." Her voice cracked a little, and she looked away like she didn't want me to see the tears in her eyes. Now, she's making sure no child has to stand in the cold, like she once did. Story 50. There's a man at the soup kitchen I volunteer at who always brings extra bread rolls to hand out, even when the kitchen already has plenty. One day, I asked him why, and he said, "When I was homeless, bread was the only thing I could count on. A loaf could last me a week, and sometimes it was the only thing that kept me going. But not all shelters had enough to go around, and I'd see people leave hungry. I swore that if I ever got back on my feet, I'd make sure no one walked away empty-handed." His voice was calm, but his hands trembled as he packed the rolls into baskets. It wasn't just bread to him. It was hope, wrapped in flour and water, something he never wanted anyone else to go without. Too long. Didn't read. The most selfless acts often come from people who faced the hardest times. Their kindness is a reflection of their past, a quiet promise to ensure others don't go through what they did. Story 51. There's a woman at the library who always stocks the free books cart with children's books, out of her own pocket. She doesn't just donate random books. She picks ones that look brand new, with vibrant covers that catch kids' eyes. One day, I asked her why she cared so much about it, and she smiled softly. "When I was a kid, we couldn't afford books at home. My only escape was the library. But sometimes the books I wanted were checked out, and I'd sit there wishing I had something of my own to read. I promised myself that when I grew up, I'd make sure kids always had something to take home." She paused, then added, "It's just a small thing, but I know how much it can mean to a child who feels like they don't have much." Her words stayed with me, and now every time I see that cart, I think of her and how she's quietly giving kids the joy she once longed for. Story 52. There's a guy in my neighborhood who hands out care packages to the homeless. Things like socks, toothpaste, snacks, and bottled water. He's not part of a charity. He just does it on his own. One day, I asked him what made him start, and he said, "A few years ago, I hit rock bottom. I was living on the street, and one day someone handed me a bag just like this. It had clean socks in it. You'd think that's such a small thing, but when you're out there, clean socks can feel like the biggest blessing in the world." He smiled, but there was something in his voice that told me the memory was still raw. Now, he keeps his car stocked with those bags, paying forward the kindness that gave him a bit of dignity when he needed it most. Story 53. There's an older man at my gym who always offers to spot people lifting weights, even if he doesn't know them. He does it so naturally that I assumed he was just friendly. But one day, I asked why he always stepped in. He said, "When I was younger, I used to lift weights at home. One time, I got pinned under the barbell, and I couldn't call for help. It was terrifying. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone else in trouble, I'd make sure they weren't alone." His voice was steady, but the way his hands fidgeted with his towel told me he hadn't forgotten that moment. It wasn't just about being helpful. It was about making sure no one else ever felt the fear he did. Story 54. There's a teacher at my daughter's school who spends hours every week building science kits for her students to take home. She buys supplies out of her own pocket, magnets, circuits, mini microscopes, so kids can experiment at home. I asked her why she went to such lengths, and she said, "When I was a kid, I loved science, but we didn't have money for anything extra. I remember staring at the catalogs for science kits and wishing I could afford even the smallest one. Now, I don't want any kid to feel like they can't explore something they're passionate about because of money." Her voice was calm, but her eyes lit up with determination. She wasn't just teaching science. She was opening doors for kids who might not even realize what's possible. Story 55. There's a guy at my local coffee shop who always leaves a generous tip, even if all he ordered was a small coffee. I asked him once why he was so consistent about it, and he said, "When I was a waiter, I once served a table that left me a $100 tip. I was working double shifts to pay rent, and that tip covered my groceries for the month. I never got to thank them, but I swore I'd pay it forward whenever I could." His voice cracked just a little, and he quickly looked away, like he didn't want me to see how much it still meant to him. Now, every time I see him slip a tip into the jar, I know it's not just about the money. It's about a quiet gratitude that's lasted for years. Too long. Didn't read. Small acts of kindness often come from people who've been on the other side of struggle. Their generosity isn't random. It's a quiet reflection of how deeply they understand what it means to need a little help. Story 56. There's a woman in my apartment building who always takes the time to water the small patch of flowers growing near the curb. The flowers aren't part of a garden. They're just a scrappy little cluster that somehow survived the harsh winters. One day, I saw her kneeling there with a small watering can, and I asked her why she cared so much about a few wildflowers. She smiled and said, "When I was little, my grandma had a tiny garden. It was her pride and joy, but we could barely afford food, let alone fancy plants. She always said, if something grows, it's worth taking care of." After she passed, I realized those flowers were her way of finding beauty in the middle of nothing. So, I guess I just see her in these. Her voice trembled a little, and I could see the emotion in her eyes. For her, those wildflowers weren't just plants. They were memories, resilience, and a way of keeping something precious alive. Story 57. There's a guy at my gym who always brings a large bag of protein bars and leaves them by the lockers with a note. "Free for anyone who needs it." I finally asked him what made him do it, and he said, "When I first started working out, I could barely afford food, let alone protein shakes or supplements. I'd watch other guys casually snack on these things, and I'd feel so out of place. It took me years to save up for the basics, and even then, I always felt like I was a step behind. Now, I just want to make sure no one else has to feel like they don't belong here. He said it so simply, but his words stuck with me. It wasn't just about the bars. It was about creating a space where no one had to feel lesser, no matter where they were starting from. Story 58. There's an older man in my neighborhood who always walks around with a pocket full of bird seed. He stops at the park every morning to feed the pigeons and sparrows, tossing the seed gently and watching as the birds flock to him. One day, I asked him why he did it every day, rain or shine. He paused, then said, "When my wife was alive, she loved watching the birds. We didn't have much, but we'd save scraps to bring to the park so she could see them up close. After she passed, I kept coming because, well, it feels like she's still here, in a way." His voice cracked slightly, and he quickly turned away, pretending to focus on the birds. It wasn't just a morning routine for him. It was a quiet act of love, a way of keeping her memory alive in the simplest, most beautiful way. Story 59. There's a teacher at the community center who always brings extra lunches for the kids who attend her after-school program. She never makes a big deal out of it, just quietly hands them out to the kids who look like they need it most. I asked her one day why she went out of her way, and she said, "When I was a kid, I used to go to an after-school program like this, and I'd sit there starving because we didn't have money for snacks. One day, the teacher gave me half of her sandwich and said, 'Don't worry, there's always enough to share.' I never forgot that. It made me feel seen when I thought no one noticed." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened as she spoke. Now, she's making sure no child under her care ever has to feel invisible or hungry. Story 60. There's a man who volunteers at the animal shelter every weekend, spending hours walking the dogs and cleaning the kennels. He's not flashy about it, just shows up, does the work, and leaves. One day, I asked him what made him dedicate so much time to it, and he said, "When I was a teenager, I had to give up my dog because my family couldn't afford to keep him. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd make sure other dogs didn't have to feel abandoned like that." He paused, then added, "I never got to see my dog again, but at least I can help these ones find a better home." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words was undeniable. For him, every leash he held and every kennel he cleaned was a small way of making amends for a choice he never wanted to make. Too long. Didn't read. Acts of kindness often come from a deep well of experience and heartache. Behind every quiet gesture lies a story of someone who's lived through something they never want others to endure. Story 61. There's a woman in my office who always keeps a small stash of feminine hygiene products in her desk drawer. Anytime a coworker is caught off guard, she discreetly hands them what they need without making it a big deal. One day, I asked her why she was always so prepared, and she said, "When I was in high school, I got my first period in the middle of class. I didn't have anything with me, and I was too embarrassed to ask for help. I ended up tying my sweatshirt around my waist and hoping no one noticed. It was humiliating." She paused and added with a faint smile, "If I can save someone else that kind of moment, it's worth it." Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, like she could still feel that awkward teenage panic. Now, her small act of kindness is her way of making sure no one else has to face that kind of anxiety alone. Story 62. There's an older man in my building who always stops to help carry groceries for anyone struggling with heavy bags. He's not particularly strong or fast, but he never hesitates to lend a hand. One day, I thanked him for helping me with my bags and asked why he was so quick to offer help. He looked at me and said, "When I was younger, I lived in a third-floor walk-up with no elevator. I'd carry bags of groceries for my mom every week because we didn't have anyone else to help. She used to say, 'A kind stranger would make this easier.' I guess now I'm trying to be that kind stranger for someone else." His voice was calm, but the way he said it made me realize how much those years had stayed with him. For him, it wasn't just about groceries, it was about fulfilling a promise to his mother, even decades later. Story 63. There's a guy in my running club who always brings an extra pair of shoes to every event. If he notices someone's shoes are falling apart or causing blisters, he offers them a pair without hesitation. One day, I asked him why he went out of his way, and he said, "When I was in high school, I couldn't afford proper running shoes. I ran track in worn-out sneakers with holes in them. One day, my coach pulled me aside and handed me a new pair. He didn't say much, just, 'You deserve these.' That moment stuck with me. I want to be that person for someone else." His voice was steady, but you could see how much it meant to him. Those shoes weren't just footwear, they were a chance, a lifeline he never forgot. Story 64. There's a woman at my local diner who always leaves a larger tip than her bill. I asked her once why she tipped so generously, and she said, "When I was a waitress, I worked double shifts just to make rent. One time, a couple left me a $50 tip on a $10 check, and it saved me from being evicted. I don't even remember their faces, but I remember how it felt. Now, I figure if I can make someone else feel that relief, I should." Her voice softened as she spoke, and I realized her generosity wasn't about showing off. It was about gratitude for a kindness that had once changed her life. Story 65. There's a man at my gym who's always the first to step in when someone looks unsure about how to use the equipment. He'll offer advice, spot them, or even demonstrate without a hint of condescension. One day, I asked him why he was so willing to help strangers, and he said, "When I started working out, I didn't know what I was doing. I was embarrassed and scared of being judged. Then one day, an older guy walked over, showed me the right way to lift, and said, 'You're stronger than you think.' That one moment gave me the confidence to keep going. I just want to pass that on." His voice was steady, but his expression softened, like he was still carrying the weight of that first moment of encouragement. Now, he's making sure no one feels lost the way he once did. Too long. Didn't read. The simplest acts of kindness often hide the most profound stories of struggle, gratitude, and a deep desire to make the world just a little easier for someone else. Story 66. There's an older woman in my neighborhood who always keeps a box of canned goods in her car. Whenever she passes by a food bank, she stops to drop it off. One day, I asked her why she was so consistent about it, and she said, "When I was a single mom, I relied on food banks to feed my kids. I remember standing in line, feeling ashamed, but also so grateful that someone cared enough to donate. It got us through some of the hardest years of my life." She paused for a moment, then added, "I promised myself that if I ever got back on my feet, I'd give back, even if it was just a little." Her voice was calm, but the way she carefully placed the cans in the box told me this wasn't just a habit. It was a deeply personal act of gratitude. Story 67. There's a man at my local park who always picks up trash, even when he's out walking his dog. He brings gloves and a small trash bag, quietly cleaning up the area as if it's his personal responsibility. I finally asked him why he did it, and he said, "When I was homeless, parks were my only refuge. I'd sleep on benches or under trees, and I hated waking up surrounded by trash. It made me feel like I didn't matter, like no one cared. Now, I just want to make these spaces better, for the people who use them, and for the ones who might need them the way I once did." His voice was steady, but his hands tightened around the leash as he spoke. It wasn't just about the park. It was about dignity, something he'd had to fight to reclaim. Story 68. There's a guy in my office who always brings breakfast for the team during big projects. Bagels, muffins, coffee, the works. One morning, I asked him why he went out of his way, and he said, "When I was starting out, I worked a job where we didn't even get a lunch break during crunch time. One day, my manager brought in coffee and donuts for everyone. It was such a small thing, but it made me feel like someone actually cared about us. I swore that if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same." His voice was casual, but there was a sincerity behind his words that stuck with me. Now every time I see him setting out those bagels, I think about how much that one small kindness meant to him, and how he's passing it on. Story 69. There's a woman at the community garden who always plants extra vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and leaves baskets of them on her neighbors' porches. I asked her once why she grew so much more than she needed, and she said, "When I was a kid, we lived on canned food because fresh produce was too expensive. I remember the first time a neighbor brought over a basket of homegrown tomatoes. It was like a gift from another world. I want to give other people that same feeling." She smiled, but her voice wavered just enough to show how deeply those memories still affected her. For her, those vegetables weren't just food. They were a way to share hope, abundance, and the kind of generosity that once changed her life. Story 70. There's an older man in my building who always stops by the mailbox with a stack of stamps and envelopes, asking if anyone needs them. At first I thought it was just a quirky habit, but one day I asked him why he did it. He smiled and said, "When I was young, I couldn't afford to mail letters to my family. I was too proud to ask for help, so I just didn't write. I lost touch with people I cared about because of something as small as a stamp. Now, I figure if I can help someone stay connected, it's worth it." His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the stack of stamps. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about making sure no one else had to feel the regret he still carried. Too long. Didn't read. Behind every thoughtful gesture lies a story of someone who's lived through struggle and found a way to turn their pain into kindness. These acts may seem small, but they carry the weight of someone's life experiences. Story 71. There's a woman in my neighborhood who bakes pies and leaves them anonymously on the doorsteps of families going through tough times. No notes, no signatures, just a pie and a gesture of kindness. I finally figured out it was her when I saw her carrying a pie late one evening. Curious, I asked why she did it, and she said, "When my husband lost his job, things got really bad. One night, someone left a pie on our doorstep. It wasn't just food, it was a reminder that someone saw us, that we weren't alone. I never found out who it was, but I promised myself I'd pass that feeling on." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened as she spoke. To her, those pies weren't just desserts. They were symbols of hope, quietly delivered to those who needed them most. Story 72. There's an older man at the dog park who always carries a bag of tennis balls, offering them to anyone whose dog looks like it needs a new toy. I asked him once why he went out of his way to do that, and he smiled wistfully. "My wife and I used to bring our dog here every day," he said. "We couldn't afford fancy toys, so we'd bring one old ball that was barely holding together. A stranger handed us a brand new one once, and our dog's tail wagged so hard I thought it might fall off. That moment stuck with me. It felt like such a small thing, but it made us feel like we belonged here." His voice softened, and he looked at the bag of tennis balls like they were treasures. Now, he's the one making sure every dog, and their owner, feels that same sense of belonging. Story 73. There's a guy at my office who always keeps a stash of hand warmers in his desk drawer during the winter. Anytime someone complains about being cold, he hands them a pair without hesitation. One day I asked him why he bothered, and he said, "When I was in college, I couldn't afford heat in my apartment. I'd sit through winter nights wrapped in blankets, holding onto hand warmers to stay warm enough to study. It wasn't much, but it got me through. Now, I figure if I can help someone else feel even a little more comfortable, why not?" His voice was calm, but the way he stared at the hand warmers for a moment told me he hadn't forgotten those freezing nights. For him, it wasn't just about warmth. It was about survival and sharing the small things that once made a difference for him. To 74. There's a woman at the local community center who volunteers to sew patches on kids' clothes for free. She sets up a small table with her sewing machine every Saturday, quietly mending torn jeans and jackets while chatting with parents. I asked her once why she started doing it, and she said, "When my kids were little, we couldn't afford new clothes. I'd sew patches on their knees and elbows to make things last longer, but I always felt embarrassed about it. One day, a neighbor offered to help, and she made the patches look so neat, so intentional, that my kids didn't feel ashamed anymore. I never forgot that." Her hands moved deftly as she spoke, and I realized she wasn't just fixing clothes. She was mending dignity, one stitch at a time. Story 75. There's a man at my church who quietly pays the utility bills for families struggling to make ends meet. He never makes a big deal out of it, just drops off an envelope at the office with the account numbers and payment details. I asked him once why he chose to help in such a specific way, and he said, "When I was a kid, our electricity got shut off more times than I can count. I remember doing my homework by candlelight and hearing my mom cry because she didn't know how she'd pay the bill. I don't want anyone else to feel that way, if I can help it." His voice was steady, but his eyes were distant, like he was still that boy sitting in the dark. Now, he's making sure other families never have to face that kind of fear and uncertainty. Too long. Didn't read. The smallest gestures often carry the deepest meaning. Behind each act of kindness lies a story of someone who's lived through hardship and now chooses to turn their pain into compassion for others. Story 76. There's a woman in my apartment building who keeps a basket of laundry supplies in the shared laundry room. Detergent, fabric softener, dryer sheets, with a note that says, "Take what you need." One day, I ran into her while she was refilling it and asked her why she went to the trouble. She smiled and said, "When I was in my 20s, I couldn't afford laundry detergent. I'd wash my clothes in the sink with dish soap and pray no one noticed. One time, a neighbor left a box of detergent in the laundry room with a note saying, 'For whoever needs it.' It was such a small thing, but it meant the world to me. I've never forgotten that." Her voice cracked slightly, and she quickly turned back to the basket, but her words stayed with me. For her, that basket wasn't just about laundry. It was about dignity, kindness, and paying forward the help that once saved her. Story 77. There's a man in my neighborhood who always shovels the sidewalks for the elderly residents after every snowstorm. He doesn't just clear a path, he meticulously scrapes every bit of ice so it's safe to walk. One day, I caught him finishing up and asked why he did it. He paused, leaning on his shovel, and said, "When I was a kid, my grandpa slipped on an icy sidewalk and broke his hip. He never fully recovered, and it made me realize how something so simple, like a clear sidewalk, can make all the difference. I can't change what happened to him, but I can stop it from happening to someone else." His voice was steady, but there was a sadness in his eyes that told me he still carried that memory. Now, every time it snows, he's out there, making sure no one else has to go through what his family did. Story 78. There's a woman at my local library who runs a free tutoring program for kids struggling with their schoolwork. She brings snacks, notebooks, and pencils for the kids who show up, even if it means buying them herself. I asked her one day what inspired her to start, and she said, "When I was in middle school, I failed math 3 times. My parents couldn't afford a tutor, so I just kept falling further behind. One of my teachers started staying after school to help me. She gave up her free time, but she never made me feel like a burden. I wouldn't have made it through high school without her." She smiled softly and added, "This is my way of doing for others what she did for me." Her voice was calm, but her eyes glistened with emotion. Every notebook she hands out, every lesson she teaches, it's her way of repaying a debt she's never forgotten. Story 79. There's an older man at the farmer's market who always buys extra produce and hands it out to families with kids. He does it so casually that most people don't even realize he's paying for their groceries. One day, I asked him why he did it, and he said, "When I was a kid, my mom used to stretch every dollar to feed us. We'd eat plain rice for days because fresh food was too expensive. One time, a neighbor gave us a bag of apples from her orchard, and it felt like Christmas. I've never forgotten how that simple act made us feel like we weren't struggling alone." He looked down at the basket of apples he was holding and added, "Now, I just want to be that neighbor for someone else." His words were simple, but the weight of his memories made them feel profound. Story 80. There's a guy in my office who always brings extra USB drives to meetings and hands them out to anyone who forgot theirs. It's such a small thing, but he does it without fail. One day, I asked him why, and he said, "When I first started working, I couldn't afford a good laptop or even basic supplies. I had to borrow USB drives from coworkers, and it always made me feel like I wasn't prepared, like I didn't belong. One day, a coworker handed me a drive and said, 'Keep it, you'll need it.' That simple act gave me the confidence to stop feeling so out of place. I just want to do that for someone else." His voice was calm, but his words carried a quiet resolve. Now, every USB drive he hands out is a reminder of how small gestures can change someone's entire outlook. Too long. Didn't read. Behind every small act of kindness lies a story of someone who knows what it's like to struggle. Their generosity isn't random. It's deeply personal, shaped by the moments that once made all the difference in their own lives.